Bom dia a todos e a todas. Então, vamos dar início com a palestra da professora Kathleen Matheos. Eu vou falar um pouquinho sobre a professora Kathleen. A professora Kathleen, ela é professora da Universidade de Manitoba, doutora pela Universidade de Kent. Ela tem uma experiência internacional bastante extensa, sobretudo no que diz respeito ao trabalho com minorias. Especialmente, ela tem vários trabalhos realizados junto a comunidades africanas e com o uso de tecnologia, né? Ela tem vários orientandos, já orientou inúmeros trabalhos de doutorado, mestrado, tem inúmeras pesquisas, né, realizadas não apenas no Canadá, mas em outros países, em particular no continente africano, e além de ter inúmeras publicações na área. Então, nesse momento, a gente vai passar a palavra a ela. Quero aproveitar e dar as boas-vindas, né, e que a gente tenha uma manhã bastante proveitosa.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you some of our experiences with blended and online learning in Canada. It's always a treat for me to come to Brazil. I've had opportunities to come earlier, especially to the Federal University in São Paulo, and we've had visitors of students who are also studying blended and online learning. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about blended learning in Canada, in particular some of the opportunities and challenges that we face as we move towards new modes of delivery. I'm going to talk about a definition, and I know definitions can often be boring, but sometimes it's a good starting point. And I'm going to draw on the Collaboration for Online Higher Education Research organizational report that we just conducted a few months ago in Canada. And I'm going to share with you the findings, the opportunities, the challenges, and the next steps, and where we plan to move ahead. Just a little bit about education, higher education in Canada, that sometimes causes us some challenges, is that education in Canada is a provincial responsibility, not a national responsibility. So each province has their own Ministry of Education, which has responsibility for both primary, secondary, and tertiary or post-secondary education. So as we move in a Canadian agenda, we need to bring together 10 provinces and 2 territories so that we're all moving in the same direction. I might also add, though, that we've been fairly successful in the last 5 or 6 years to bring some consistency in higher education. In the early 2000, we signed an agreement among all the ministers of education to allow students to transfer courses between institutions, and not only to transfer courses from traditional institutions, to travel, but also to transfer courses between open and distance and traditional, which can be used towards your degree. So within that context and environment, we undertook this study. When we looked in our study and basically across Canadian institutions, how we define blended learning is, again, on the continuum of online learning. If we consider a continuum, we have in one end online and in the other end face-to-face. And as we think about blended learning, and for us in a traditional university, as this university is, with a strong focus on both access for students and research, we need to think of a way that we can use both face-to-face and technology. So Randy Garrison and Norm Vaughan in 2008 put together a definition for blended learning, and they talked about it, as you can see, as the organic integration of face-to-face and online components. And it's really an innovative approach in that it allows us to truly redesign the course, so that we have to think and be much more reflective on our teaching as we move from a traditional face-to-face or from an online course to move to blending, where we put together both the face-to-face elements and the online elements. One thing that's interesting about blended learning, and an interesting aspect of it, is in our university, oftentimes people say, oh, I think I'll blend my class because next Thursday I'm not coming to the university, so I'll have the students work online. We've all been in that situation, but that's really what Randy Garrison asks us to guard against. It's to really think about what our students need to learn. What are the outcomes? And all of us that work in distance think a lot about outcomes. We have to be very clear. We have to be very concise in our expectations of students. But when we think about teaching face-to-face, sometimes we don't think much beyond the lecture. We think, okay, I've got my lecture notes, I have my content, and if the students have difficulty, I can explain it to them in class. Very different in an online class. But when you're blending learning, you really need to think about your course. And we've all taught in face-to-face, and we'll think, what can we put online? What kinds of things could the students do on their own? What would be better for the students to do? Could they watch a video? Could they read text? Could they do a web search? Could they have a discussion group? Are there things that we could do online that would better serve the learning needs of our students? And that's what he asks us to do when we design courses. He asks us to be reflective. And it's interesting that the instructors last year at our university that developed blended all said it made them think a lot more about teaching. It made them be much more reflective in how they teach. We oftentimes think about our subject, but we don't always think about how we teach it. So as we look at a blended learning course, we think about what could we teach face-to-face and what could students do online. And how do we integrate what we do face-to-face with what we do online? It's not two courses, but it's a matter of a student coming face-to-face, and then it leads into their online work. And we call that triggering in blended learning, that if we have a lecture, we may send them away with something to do online, to find web resources, to critique something. If they work online, we may ask them to work together on a group project and then present it. So we need to ensure that there's a continuum of learning in blended learning. This is a graph that we put together, and it kind of puts blended learning in the center. But if you have a look at the visual, you'll also see that there in the corner of the right-hand side at the bottom, there's online blended learning. And this is a new type of blended learning that's emerging, and Michael Power at Laval University in Quebec talks about that. And he believes in online blended learning that you use synchronous technologies. You use particularly Web 3.0 technologies like Skype, Google Talk, and with that you replace the classroom. And the university, Tele-University in Quebec, that's what they consider blended learning. So you can see already within one country we have multiple ways of dealing with blended learning. When we were asked by the Canadian government to put together this study, we were asked by the Human Resource Development Policy Branch. It was interesting, we weren't asked at all by higher education because there isn't a Canadian overarching piece of government that talks about higher education. But their policy analysts had read much about blended learning as a promising practice. And so they said, why don't we have more blended learning in Canada? And so they asked us to do a short study, and it was a very, we had a short window to do it, to look at a sample of Canadian universities to see what we were doing and to make some recommendations. Well, some of the context that we thought about, well, almost all of the Canadian universities, all except one Canadian university, has some form of blended learning. In fact, Canadian Virtual University, which is a consortium of universities that share online materials, found that they had students enrolled in 500,000 credit hours. So that's a huge number of courses. In 2010, 70% of all US universities had online learning. The Collaboration for Online Higher Education had 5 conferences on blended learning, and we're about to have our 6th conference in October. And what's been interesting, at the beginning of our conferences, people talked about what is blended learning, but now the research has ramped up to evidence-based. Why are we doing it? What model works? And how is it actually quantifiable in terms of student performance, student success, student retention? Time to degree for students. We have an HRSDC funded report, which I'm going to talk about in blended learning. And so this report is the one that I'll be referring to, and it'll be on the slides in the virtual conference. And also our partner organization, which works solely with online learning, not blended learning, was also conducted a paper, and it looked at the challenges and opportunities in Canada. Both of these have fairly recent data. A little bit about COHERE, the Collaboration of Online Higher Education and Research. We're a group of universities throughout Canada. As you can see, we're spread across Canada. And we're all basically teaching, program, and research intensive universities. So we have upwards of 15,000. My university has 25,000 students. And we've always delivered programs face-to-face. But in addition, we've all had some form of online and distance delivery. At my university, we have about 10,000 distant students that move between being face-to-face and distant students, and that's pretty common. At some of the universities, they have more, at some they have less. But when we talk about with our face-to-face faculty members, we need to think of ways to use technology better, to build on what we learned from distance and what we learned from face-to-face to put together a hybrid or a course that brought together the best of both worlds. So as we as you see, and I won't read these to you because I know that you can see them, we put together the parameters of the study, which is essentially what we spoke about, which was to talk about the best practices and to talk about the challenges and opportunities. We asked a series of questions, asked them both online, using Skype. In some cases we used the phone, and in some cases we met with the faculty people face to face. And we came up with some very interesting overall findings that met with the literature. We saw it as a promising practice. In fact, lots of the research talk about blended learning as being one of the most promising practices in higher education. A recent study that they did in the US found that both students and faculty didn't want to give up all of the face-to-face, the traditional students, but they wanted flexibility, and there were options for them to study online. We saw that there was increased growth in the research area, again in evidence-based practice. We also found, unfortunately, in many institutions, it was a small group, sometimes a marginalized group. It wasn't part of the strategic agenda in the university. As distance is sometimes offered in one piece of the university, this too was offered. We also found there was a need for a strategic and organized approach. But the best practices resulted in our improved teaching and learning. In other words, we had better success with students. Students had better evaluations, and they also did better. Greater flexibility, greater student satisfaction, better student performance. A recent study at University of Central Florida, 85% of the students got a C+ or better in blended learning courses. Optimizing resources. Things that we did in a face-to-face environment could be used in blended. Also things that we used in distance. And a confluence of literacy. Students learn to use new technologies. They learn to work together virtually, which is something that we need to do in this world. When we talked about how we developed and enhanced, essentially, these are the kinds of things that we did. But I think it's important, too, that we talk about what a global graduate is. And recently, with the Federal University of São Carlos, we conducted a virtual online course in Indigenous literature, where we brought together students from São Carlos, students from University of Manitoba, where they shared lectures in real time and worked together virtually on projects. So that's one example of how we create global competencies. For students, the greatest thing was flexibility. Over 55% of our students are working part-time in Canada. This gives them a new opportunity to take courses in a flexible environment. Again, I can't stress more that it's the best of both worlds. It allows us to think about teaching differently and add new technologies. It's a comfortable place in the continuum for faculty, and it can generate great savings for the institutions. University of Central Florida said that they saved almost $7 million in building construction by using a combination of blended learning in their classes, where they reduced the classroom's time and allowed more use of classrooms. The barriers that we felt were really, truly the human factor. We certainly have the technology. Much of it is available and it's open source. But as we look for new technologies, how do we change ourselves? And as Dr. Romano talked yesterday, so many times we're afraid of change, but it will happen. How do we embrace change so that we can do things differently in a positive manner? For the next step for all of us is to develop a strategic agenda, led by our senior administration, but in consultation with faculty. An implementation plan must bring together multi-stakeholders. Essentially, we just need to do it. We have the resources. We have both the technical and the pedagogical resources. We need to continually evaluate and revise. Thank you.